Hello and welcome to the Indy Author podcast. Today, my guests are Greta Boris and Megan Haskell. Hey, how are you doing?
Hey, good. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. So, to give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Greta Boris is the USA Today Bestselling author of The Seven Deadly Sins Murders, a psychological suspense series, and The Mortician Murders, a paranormal cozy mystery series. She hails from sunny Southern California, where based on her books, which are all set there, things are darker than you'd expect. Her stories have been called atmospheric and unputdownable. And Megan Haskell is the award-winning author of the Sanyare Chronicles, an action-packed female-led fantasy adventure. Her other titles include epic fantasy Forged in Shadow and the upcoming women's contemporary fantasy Aether Bound. A Southern California transplant, she's living the dream of writing while raising her two daughters in Orange County. And together, Greta and Megan founded The Author Wheel, a website dedicated to helping writers become authors and keep their stories rolling. With over 20 years of writing and publishing experience between them, they've made the mistake so you don't have to. And so we are here to talk about a couple of topics. We're going to be getting to the exciting topic of their Kickstarter campaign called Foundations of Great Storytelling, Preparing to Write. But to sort of ease us into that, we're going to be talking today mainly about planning a novel. And you guys can talk about this more a little bit later, but the Foundations of Great Storytelling, Preparing to Write combines some quick guides, productive writing habits, understanding your genre, and planning a novel, as well as another kind of bonus piece of content. So we're going to be focusing for the purposes of our conversation today on planning a novel. And specifically, we're going to be talking about brainstorming, world building, standalone or series, and a story Bible. And so we're going to start out with brainstorming. And Greta, I'm going to toss this to you to find out what you and Megan have discovered in your experience is a good approach to brainstorming.
So we have a bunch of little tools in our book that we use. And our approach to lots of things is that some things work for me, some things work for Megan, some things don't work for either one of us, but they work for other authors we know. So we like to just throw out lots of ideas so that people can kind of find their own thing. So one of the things that we both do is this concept of planting seeds for a story well before we start to write, sometimes months, sometimes even a year before. And we just let those ideas germinate in our minds, and we do some research on topics that interest us. Basically, I feel like brainstorming should be developing your curiosity in a topic and letting that curiosity grow. Sometimes you find, you know what it's like? As soon as you decide, we have an Audi. As soon as we decided that we were going to buy an Audi, every car on the road was an Audi. So I think it's the same kind of thing. When you start going in a direction, you get like a germ of an idea for a book. Pretty soon, your every TV show, other people's books, everything will start to lead you in that direction. And I think sometimes as authors, we tend to feel like, oh, that's not productive because we're not putting words on the page. But I think it is super productive, and it will help you to write a quicker, cleaner book if you go ahead and give yourself that time to brainstorm. So that's sort of the reasoning behind it. But we have lots of tools that we use. I love to do like a, what do they call those things? You know, where you have a bubble in the middle and then
Mind map.
Thank you. I couldn't think of the
Yeah.
word. Mind map. Mind maps are great. I like those. Megan likes to sleep on it. I'm sure she can talk more about that.
I do. It's called productive daydreaming, or at least that's what I call it. And maybe it's my excuse to take a nap. I don't know. But I think it works, right? So going off of what Greta was saying too. So for example, my current series, which is the Rise of Lilith series, which starts with Aether Bound. When I came up with that idea, it started off with like a spark of inspiration. I was watching YouTube videos on the myth of Lilith, right? And so months before I ever started writing that book, I started thinking about and researching and germinating on that idea. But then when it comes down to the actual writing, when you get stuck, you're plotting, or if you're more of a pantser like I am, you'll start writing and then you'll get to a spot where you just go, I have no idea where this is supposed to go next, right? That's going to happen. When that happens, the thing that I like to do is I use that same germination concept and I plant the seed in my mind. And then I go and I sit down and I let myself drift. So I find a comfy spot, couch, or I have a armchair kind of a thing in my office. And so I think about the problem, I think about the plot or the character or the world building, the thing that I'm trying to solve. And I put that in my brain before I sit down. And then I sit down and I close my eyes and I drift, and I don't intend to fall asleep. Let me be clear. Sometimes I do, but I don't intend to fall asleep. But the idea is that by letting your subconscious rise to the surface, you're able to, what's the Stephen King? It's the boys in the basement. You're letting the boys in the basement come out to play. And I end up finding that when I do that, I actually wake up or come back to myself with the solution or something that will lead me to the solution, that pushes the story forward, that lets me take that next step. So I find that's one of the brainstorming techniques that I came up with. I think I'm going to take credit for it. I'm sure other people do something similar too, but I'm going to take credit for it. The productive daydreaming.
Well, I try to do
brainstorming.
productive night dreaming because I often think of intentionally have in mind a plot issue that I'm struggling with, and I make a point of thinking about it as I'm falling asleep.
Yep.
And the same kind of thing. Oftentimes I'll wake up with the answer.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the planting of the seed, right? Like you prime your brain to solve the problem that you're having. And so whether that's before you ever start writing or whether that's during the process as you're falling asleep at night or taking a nap during the day, it really does help, like that giving your subconscious the freedom to play.
Yeah.
It does sound like there are kind of two aspects of this. One is the more structured, like mind mapping, and I'll say the semi-structured, like thinking about something as you have your eyes closed. But Greta, I think early on you had talked about brainstorming as something that we're always doing, just in the world we're intaking. You were saying, oh, once you decided to get an Audi, everybody was driving an Audi, but so you're perceiving the world around you. Do you think that brainstorming always has to be intentional, like intentional with a goal of what you want to, the topic you want to brainstorm? And how do you separate that from just the incoming sensory experience we put into our writing?
So I actually think that it goes in phases. That brainstorming goes, and it often starts with, just like Megan said, like a spark of an idea. Or for my Mortician series, my daughter sent me a link to the Ask a Mortician YouTube show. And I thought, oh my gosh, she would make such a good character for a book. Boom. That was the beginning of the idea. And then I didn't even think about writing a book yet exactly. So you have this phase where it's just very organic. You're just kind of wandering through the world. And because you've had this spark, things keep lighting up. The Audis keep appearing, that phase. And then at some point, I do think it becomes intentional, because at some point you say, okay, this idea has legs. I could do something with this idea. And then when it becomes more intentional, then I feel like you sort of move into phase 2, which is more the research, where you specifically and purposefully start to look for other people's books or TV shows or nonfiction articles. Or I watched a lot of the Ask a Mortician show and read her first book. It's a memoir about her time in a crematorium, and it's called Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. She's so funny. Anyway, so I immersed myself in Caitlin Doughty is her name. If anybody out there is interested, she's amazing. Caitlin Doughty's world. And that's like the immersive section of time. And that can take as long as it takes. Sometimes it's quick, sometimes it's long. And then I think the third phase is really the phase where you start purposefully, like mind mapping, getting stuff down on paper, whether you use a big whiteboard or you use notebooks or you make lists or you actually physically start putting ideas down on paper, trying to get some cohesion. And I think that's the place often that you end up in the Megan's favorite, which I do think is kind of an excuse for her to take a nap, but I didn't say that. But that
It
productive
works.
daydream, it does. And I do more the Maddie version, which is the plant the seed before I go to sleep. And often I'll wake up with an idea. And I think that's a little bit more when the rubber's meeting the road. And you've got all these ideas that are starting to click together like little puzzle pieces, but oh, I'm missing a piece over here. And what is that piece? And I think that your subconscious can provide, but it provides because you fed it. I think that's the part that we often miss, is that we need to feed our subconscious the material so that it can start to put those ideas together and pop them out into your conscience. So, and that would be the same way. That was my very long-winded answer to your very short question.
So I'm going to actually use that as a sort of entree to the second topic we wanted to talk about, which is world building. Because I think a lot of times it's this gathering of fodder that you then get to play out in a world building scenario. So, Megan, I'm going to throw this topic to you first and
Yeah.
ask you to talk about some best practices about world building.
Well, sure. So, the interesting thing is that I'm a fantasy writer, right? So, fantasy world building is foundational, right? Like, because you have to create a new culture or you have to create a magic system. You have all these elements that don't exist in the real modern day Earth world. And so I think it becomes more of a intentional practice for fantasy authors, but it's really needed for everybody. So I have a friend, Matt Presley. I have his book back here. He wrote, it's World Building for Fantasy Fans and Authors. And I use that as a primer for my own world building. But he goes into depth on how you develop magic systems, how you look at these different cultures and create what he calls analog cultures. And so what we've done is taken that and sort of condensed it down into an applicable framework and checklist for anyone, no matter what your genre is. And so really what it comes down to is knowing the place, right? That knowing the world that your characters exist in. And for fantasy, like I said, like that might be a completely different world, a secondary universe, a secondary place where it's, if you think about Lord of the Rings, for example, right? It's not on Earth, but there are elements that are recognizable from Earth. And there are creatures that are new and different. And each of those creatures has a culture or a language, even in the case of Tolkien, because he was a linguist first. And so you have to develop that setting and that place for your characters to exist. And so what we talk about is how to do that, even for a contemporary romance, right? You still have to have, if you're going to have a small town romance, you have to know what that small town is. You have to draw out the map, maybe, of that town. You have to know where the pharmacy is and where the general store and where the fields are that your characters are going to go off and have their meet cute in, or whatever it is. You have to know that stuff. So we walk through what are the steps? What are the things that you have to think about as you prepare the world for your characters to live in? Because that's really what it comes down to. And so, yeah, it can be everything from the actual setting, the town, the city, the place that they exist in, the culture that's around them. So if you're writing historical, for example, you need to know the historical culture that your characters exist in. You're going to have those details accurate because your readers are going to demand they're accurate. So you have to do your research to prepare yourself so that you understand that culture. You understand the technology that's involved. You understand the geography around the characters and all those elements that have to come together to give your characters a place to be so that when they live, your readers think they are actual people that are actually living in that place, no matter how magical, modern, or historical that place might be.
So I'm going to throw a follow up to Greta, and this is that how much is too much? And does the answer to that vary based on whether you're writing a fantasy or writing a story based in Southern California?
Well, I think too much is when you never get around to writing your book. Because we have had people in our workshops, and God bless them, it's almost always men who are writing sci-fi or fantasy. And they've been building their world for 5 years and they've not written a word of it yet. So if your world building is stopping you and take from writing the book, then obviously it's getting to be too much.
Can I ask a question about that? Because I'm wondering,
Sure.
the experience you've had with the people in your workshops, are they capturing facts about their worlds in a document, but it's not their book because it's not, for example, plotted? Or is it just something that they haven't even put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard at all, and it's all just stored in their heads? The balance between they're not writing their book and documenting their world.
So they usually have like many, many, many thousands of words.
Yeah,
Written.
extensive binders of information in some cases.
Really a lot. But they haven't set the characters into the world yet. So they haven't gotten to the story aspect. They just have the setting. It's almost like if you
the magic or the technology, right? I think especially in sci-fi and fantasy, which is where, like I was saying before, like we as fantasy authors, as sci-fi authors, we are required to do more intentional world building, I think, than some other settings as a part of our idea process. But that's it can get to the point where you're spending so much time researching technology, or you're researching creating magic systems and making it hard magic or hard sci-fi, that, as Greta was saying, you don't start creating a plot, you don't start creating characters. It's just about the surroundings. Sorry, Greta, I interrupted. I got excited.
That's okay. I'm used to it. But no, what Megan said is exactly accurate. So that's one end of the spectrum. And then the other end of the spectrum is, let me say one quick thing about that end of the spectrum before I go to the other end, is that what's really hard for writers who do that is then they want to info dump when they start writing, because they just spent 5 years building this amazing world. They just want to tell you how all the parts go and do. And you're like, no, you can't put that in your story. Your readers don't care until they do. You know, you need to know it, but it can't all be info dumped into your book. So that's the ditch on that side of the road. And then the ditch on the other side of the road is more commonly done by people who are writing a contemporary novel that doesn't have magic in it. So like my 7 Deadly Sins series, I was setting it where I live. The first book is set in Laguna Beach, California. It's a real place. Each book is set in a local town. So I didn't think I needed to really world build at all. Well, and then I kept stopping. I'd get a couple of chapters in and I'd be like, oh, so do I really want to murder somebody in a real house? Or do I want to create a fictitious home and a fictitious address? Do I really want to use that street? Do I want them text messaging? Is that going to date my book later on? Do I want to include current politics or not go there? Because again, that's going to date your book. What's the culture of Laguna Beach like? When I have some bits in art galleries, maybe I should have gone to the art galleries and thought about that beforehand. So that's the other end of the spectrum, where you just don't do any world building because you think you don't need to. And you do.
Yeah, it is interesting that we can be quite sure that nobody has gone to the fantasy world until you introduce that to your readers. And I've never been to Laguna Beach. Maybe I had been to Laguna Beach years ago and don't remember it very well. And it's interesting to think about it in the same light, that there are going to be things about any environment that the vast majority of your readers are not going to know intimately. And again, you don't want to, same rules apply. You don't want to info dump everything about Laguna Beach, but giving a few choice details about where the best bakery shop is and how much you're going to pay for a latte there and things like that could be very telling. And serve the same.
That's really part of the key with world building, is that you have to give these characters an anchor so that the readers can find their place within your story as well, right? It's giving the characters a place to live, but it's also giving the readers a way to feel attached to that place, and then ultimately that character as well. So like you're saying, like if you know the price of a coffee in Laguna versus the airport versus some Midwest town where you're just going to get a cup of Joe that's black and straight up, right? Like that is going to change your reader's perception and how they interact with your story as well. And so that's why that stuff is important. It gives that grounding sensation for your reader and makes it a real place, which we all want to get lost in story. That's why we write. That's why we read. So you have to let your reader do that.
And another thing too is that really, I think world building is still brainstorming adjacent because, and I'm sure both of you have had this experience where you're not thinking you're brainstorming, you're thinking you're world building. And there's a house on Cliff Drive in Laguna Beach that everybody used to call the witch's house. And I'm walking by, I look at the house and I'm like, oh, yeah, that's the house. And then my creativity, the boys in the basement are going, well, I have girls in the basement. The girls in the basement are going crazy. It's like, oh, yeah. And this creaky thing could happen here because the door might make, and what about that fig tree? And that fig tree could play this part in my story and it'll actually give me plot ideas. And so those kinds of things I have one book or two books set in San Juan Capistrano, which is the oldest continuously residential lived in, I don't know what the wording is, city in Southern California. And I used to go down to a coffee shop down there in the old section and write. And just the smells and the train going by and all that gave me ideas. So world building can also be plot informing. How's that?
Yeah, I think that the idea of the world building is not just the techness, not just the two moons, it's all the senses. I think that's a really great point. I actually just read Rachel Housel Hall's We Lie Here, I think is the name of it. And I was so impressed with how often she brought up sense, smell sense, aromas, and how evocative that was in terms of me really feeling like I was there in the world and not just sort of removed from it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. She has another one. We were on a panel together one time and she gave me a copy of her book because she uses the 7 deadly sins in it. And it's set on an island and it's kind of like We All Fall Down, the Agatha Christie. And again, just you were on that island. And I'm sure that was her world building. What would this island be like? And I'm sure she did research about islands in that part of the world and all of that. So it really informed the story itself too.
Just a quick break from the interview. Are you getting value from the podcast? Please consider supporting it and all the work I do at the Indy Author by becoming a patron. To pledge a monthly contribution, go to patreon.com/the Indy Author, or to make an occasional contribution, perhaps to indicate the value that a specific episode or resource provided to you on your creative voyage, scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. And now, back to the interview. So I am going to launch into topic 3 that we want to discuss in terms of planning a novel, and that is standalone or series. And I think this is an interesting one because we've talked about reams and reams of world building material, and maybe it's more than you need for a single book. Maybe it's more than you need for an entire series. But I think this is interesting because I put this, and I'm sure you guys put this further down the list because sometimes you don't know going into it, like when you're planning your novel, right? When I wrote my first novel, I didn't know whether it was going to be a standalone or a series. So, Greta, I'm going to throw this out to you as you start making this consideration. What factors play into whether it's a standalone or a series?
So I actually took a course about series writing, and this instructor divvied it up into 4 different types of series. And they go from something that's almost like one big long book, like Lord of the Rings, which
the really good book series.
Thank you. They're really big book series, which is just one big long story divvied up into pieces. And then there is the one that's very common in mystery thriller genre, where you have the detective who returns book after book after book after book. So it's the same. And then they get a little bit less connected and a little bit less connected. So one of the things I think you need to decide in the beginning is that if it is possible to turn it into a series, which kind of a series might it turn into? And so, like, for instance, when I wrote The 7 Deadlies, I knew I did not have an interesting enough protagonist to carry a series. I just didn't have an idea for that. But I wanted to write these books that were about an everyman So a real estate agent or a Pilates instructor or a different career person who bumps into crime and has this life and death huge moment in their lives. Well, you can't have a real estate agent bumping into dead bodies every other month. It's just not very realistic. Unlike a mortician who can. So that was basically connected standalones. And since I was seeking traditional publication, I knew I wanted that to be able to be a standalone, the first book, but hopefully I could pitch to a publisher the idea that, look, I have other books that I could write that could be a loosely connected series. So I think understanding how different kinds of series work is really helpful. And I think it's also something we tend not to do when we very first are coming out of the gate.
I think it's interesting too that a lot of this would depend on the world building, because there are these books like I'm running a B&B by the beach, and it's surprisingly enough, every couple of months one of my guests dies. Those ones
I'm
where
not going to that B&B.
You're really asking the readers to suspend disbelief big time. But if you're building the kind of world that is appealing to those readers, they're willing to go with it. And I think it's because the world is compelling. So they're willing to say, okay, it's probably not likely that one bed and breakfast is going to have this many murders, but okay, I'm going to go with it.
Yeah. And I was going to say too, a part of I think in modern storytelling, modern book writing, right? A series just makes sense. Our readers want them. They want to exist in that world. If you're going to spend all that time creating a world for your characters to live in and for your readers to attach to, then you need to write more than one book. You just do, right? And if you want to make this a career as an author and you want to do more than just like write that one book, your one bucket list book, then writing in a series makes a lot of sense. And then to Greta's point, knowing the kinds of series that exist and what works in your genre, which is another thing we talk about a lot in the Kickstarter. We have a whole quick guide on understanding your genre. All these things are interrelated. They're all linked. So understanding what series are selling, what types of series are selling within your genre. What are your readers' expectations? Are they looking for the same world, but a different romantic couple, for example, in each book, right? Like that's a pretty classic romance series style. Each book is a different couple. They all have a happily ever after, but they all exist within the same world, and that's how they're ultimately linked. Or epic fantasy is the Tolkien really, really big book series where every book in the trilogy or quartet or however many books you're going to end up writing is just a continuation of the same journey, of the same stories with the same characters and the same maybe overarching conflicts. So understanding your genre so that you can understand what types of series works ultimately helps you make that decision. And it's a good thing to know before you ever start writing the first book so that you can plan for it, so that you know what your expectations are and what your actual goal that you're moving toward ultimately is.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting question because, like, if you're writing a series called The 7 Deadly Sins, you better be pretty sure that you have 7 books in you. Like, you don't want to write 6 of them and then poop out. Or, like, I always think of Sue Grafton, if circumstances being different, one assumes felt confident that she was going to hold her attention through an entire alphabet of crimes to stick with that.
Lot.
Do you
And
have
then
any guidance?
She missed the Z. That was
She missed
so
the
sad.
Z, yeah. But when people are starting out, it's very hard to know. Like when I started the Lizzie Ballard books, I thought that the first Lizzie Ballard book might be a standalone. And I tried to write it in such a way that if that was the only book there was, it would be satisfying. But if I wanted to continue with it, there was room to do that. And I think it turned out because there was this percolating going on in the back of my mind that was probably planning more than I was consciously aware of. But if people are at the very beginning of their careers and they're hearing, I think very reasonably, that series is a good way to go, but they're not sure how many books they have in them, do either of you have any advice for how to direct them?
So I think the basic starter, if you want to write more than one book. So your idea, your plan that you went through, which was to say, I have an idea. I think it could have serious potential, but I'm not sure. So I'm going to make this first book satisfying in and of itself so that if it is just a standalone, it still works and nobody's left wanting at the end. That's a great strategy to start off with. After that, if you know that you want to write more than one book, the basic building block is honestly a trilogy, because then you can compound that, right? You can write your first trilogy, you got 3 books. Well, maybe I still want to keep this story. So then you write another trilogy with the same characters and you can continue the story arc. So you have these 3 books story arcs. It's a really nice building block for a longer series. And then you can always end it after 9 books, 12 books. Like, you just keep multiplying it out. Right?
It reminds me of a conversation I had with Edwin Hill. I unfortunately can't remember the actual title of the episode, but go to theindyauthor.com/podcast and look for Edwin Hill. But he was saying that if he was writing a contract with a publisher for books, it would always be in sets of 3 for business as well as creative reasons.
I think it makes sense. And, that a 3 book is just a nice, 3 is such a satisfying number. I don't know why for our brains. I'm sure there's some psychological reason, but 3 is a satisfying number and it's an easy building block to keep moving forward. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yep. So 7 was really ambitious for my first series, but because they each sort of had their own theme. So that's another thing to think about, is if there is a particular set of themes that you would like to explore in a certain world. That's another way you can structure a series. So you could use the 7 deadly sins like I did, which works for crime because you don't have a crime without people misbehaving, right? So that works. If you did the 5 senses and you had a book that sort of explored each of the senses. So those kinds of, that's another way to think about writing a series. So I just wouldn't pick the alphabet for my first. I mean, obviously she knew what she was doing, but, and also just if you are trying to go for a traditional publishing deal, it is harder to sell series because it's exactly the opposite of the indie world where everybody encourages you to do series. Publishers are a little more reluctant because they're like, well, I don't know if this book is going to sell. So just be aware of that. Whereas writing a standalone that could expand is a really good strategy if you're looking for a traditional deal. I did get a contract that was for the first 2 books, first right of refusal on the other 5, but I structured the contract so that if for whatever reason she didn't want the other 5, I got the first 2 back because you can't have the 2 deadly sins.
Yeah.
So it has to be. So just in terms of a business decision, that's something to think about. Also, and I had to do this before I signed my publishing contract, but I think it's a really good idea, whether you're an indie author or whatever, is that I had to do like a quick little sketch, couple of paragraphs on an idea for each of the books. Now, I don't even know what happened to those, and I didn't use them, but it showed that I could, you know what I mean? And that I could have gone back to those. And actually, I do think a little bit they came into play, but that's something to think about too. You don't have to come up with a full plot, a full outline or anything like that for future books in a series. But if you want to know if that novel has series potential, I mean, brainstorming what could happen next, what could be in, say, like Megan's idea, 3 books, what could that trilogy look like? What were the themes you would explore? And those kinds of things. I think that's really, really, really helpful.
Yeah. So I'm going to use this as a transition to the 4th topic we wanted to talk about, which is Story Bible. And I think there's a nice transition here. Once you've built your world, once you've decided where you want to take a series or even a standalone, maybe we can talk a little bit about whether Story Bible applies in standalone circumstance. What is the role of a Story Bible? What is a Story Bible maybe to begin with? What is the role? And how should an author use it as they're working on their standalone or their series? And Megan, I'm going to throw this out to you.
Sure. So a story Bible, just as a quick definition, is basically a document or binder. You can format it in a lot of different ways that contains the detail of your story. So, for example, you might have your protagonist. Well, what does your protagonist look like? Blue eyes, brown hair, tall, and leggy. Maybe that's your description. I don't know. But So you write that down, and then you do that for all your side characters as well. And then you have your settings. Okay, so what is, in my case, I'm thinking about my story right now. So she works in a bar. What does that bar look like? What are some of the details? What are some of the descriptions so that going forward, you maintain consistency? And that's really the ultimate goal of the Story Bible, is a reference document or reference material that you can go back to make sure that your series really stays consistent over time and you don't screw up. Eye color is a really common one, or maybe they have a dog in book 1 and that dog for some reason never shows up again in book 3. And you're like, wait a second, that doesn't work, right? You got to keep those details consistent. So why do we use them? So that we don't have to remember everything in our head, because that's impossible when you're writing a series, especially a longer series. If you're writing 3 books or 4 books, you can't go back, or you don't want to go back and reread everything before you write book 5. That just would take a lot of extra time. So instead, you have this Story Bible document that you can refer to. And it's something that I wish I had done when I was writing my first book and my first series. I did it after the fact. I actually hired someone to create the initial Story Bible, and then I've updated it since then. But I wish I had known about it when I started writing. It's one of those detailed things that you don't think about when you're new, but it is so important because it is so hard to just keep all those details straight. So if you're planning on writing a standalone, I'm not sure you need one, but if you have even an inkling of an idea that you might want to turn that book into a series or a trilogy, having the beginnings of that Story Bible, and all you have to do is copy and paste some of those details as you're writing and put them into a document or whatever structure you want to use. And so as you're writing, if you write the description of your main character, just copy and paste that paragraph over into the Bible so that you have it down the road and you don't have to go look it up and do a Control F on your entire book.
Look for leggy.
Yeah, right? And then you have to assume you actually remember the right word, right? So maybe you didn't say leggy, maybe you said long legs, and then you're not going to find it. So it's really just a good practice to get in the habit of when you're first getting started so that you have that document going forward.
Yeah. Greta, thoughts about Story Bibles?
Yes. So I also have been using Google Docs, and that way I can give my editor a link to the page, which is super helpful for her because she doesn't have to stop and shoot me all the emails. She can go look, but it's super helpful for what Megan was saying, a reference. But the other thing that I'm finding is that it helps you not reinvent the wheel. So for instance, in the Mortician series in book 1, she's still a hairdresser. She works in a salon and it's a gossip mill. And that's where she gets a lot of her clues from. Anyway, there's one particular character. She's just a walk-on character. She's only in 1 chapter and she's like the queen of gossip and she knows everything. 4 books later, I needed a gossip. And I started to write a gossip character. And then I went, wait, I a gossip. And so I could go back and find her name, find her description, where she lived, all the stuff about her, and bring her back. And number 1, it helps me not reinvent the wheel. It's a time saver. And number 2, and maybe number 2 is really number 1, it really connects readers to the stories because it makes that world feel really real. That you're bringing back a walk-on character from your first book into the 3rd book. It's like, this is more of a cohesive world because you got to remember, readers read much faster than you write. And so, I'll have a reader grab my first book in series, like if I do a promo or something, and then they'll blow through all 4 in a couple of weeks. So they remember the gossip from book 1 that I forgot about because I wrote her 2 years ago. So it's those kinds of things. I think it really creates cohesion. Now, we did have on our podcast, we talked to Troy Lambert about Plotter, and I haven't done this yet, but I would love to take a look at some point. because apparently Plotter has a really great tool for creating a story Bible. So just a little shout out to Plotter.
Well, there is a video on the Indy Author YouTube channel where Troy did a demo of Plotter that's available for people to take a look at. So if anyone's curious
nice.
about Plotter,
Yeah.
they can look at that. Have
Yeah.
you ever thought about actually sharing your story Bible like as a reader magnet? Have either of you done that or thought about it?
I've thought about it. So there's actually, again, fantasy being what it is, there are a couple tools that let you create a wiki. So for your fans, basically. So you can go in and like cross-reference your setting descriptions with your characters that exist in that setting, and then the political conflicts and who's involved and what kind of, sword they're using, and whether that sword is magical, and whether maybe it's a sentient sword. It creates this whole like cross-linked wiki. I started to try to play with it, and it was very time consuming. And so it was actually taking away from my writing time, which was problematic for me. But because I'm very limited time, especially when I was actually playing with it, which was a few years ago, and my kids were still really young. So time was definitely my most valuable asset. And it was just a little too time consuming, because for your readers, you have to make it fun and interesting and more professional, I guess maybe is the right word. Whereas when it's just for me, I just copy and paste, and it's just easy, and it doesn't take any extra time. That being said, I do know some fantasy authors in particular who have used it to great success to build their fan base and to really engage with their readers and bring their stories to life more. So I know it can be done very well, and it can be something that readers find absolutely fascinating and fun, and then they can add to it. And depending on how you set it up, there's other things you can do with it. You can add in maps, you can add in charts and artwork and all these other things. So it can be a really, really cool add-on. You just have to be prepared for the time that it's going to take to make.
Yeah, it's interesting when you're talking about the non-textual side of it with all the stuff coming in with AI generated art, that there could be some fun options there of creating
Yeah.
images of your characters. I've resisted in general ever showing a depiction of my character because I've wanted the readers to be able to come up with that themselves, the actual like detailed facial features and things like that. I finally made an exploratory exception by putting a picture up on my Facebook page showing Anne Kinnear. And I'm curious to see if readers connect with that anymore. But one way that I did here are my two tips about story Bibles. One is that I did start picking actors to play the parts, not because I ever want to share that information or the pictures with anyone, but I give them to my audiobook narrator. And I find that it gives her a much better idea of the kind of voice to do for a character if she sees the kind of person I see playing that character. And then the
That
other,
makes a lot of sense.
yeah,
That's a
that's been
great
very
idea.
helpful. The other thing that I was thinking of is you were saying you don't know to look up Leggy if you don't remember that you've called him Leggy, is to make a note of characters' nicknames. Because if I remember that Owen McNally has a nickname for his niece that's not Lizzie, I am never going to find that on a search unless I just go back and start reading or put a note up on my social media saying, could somebody please remind me of what Owen McNally's nickname is for his niece?
Fan sourcing.
Fan sourcing, exactly. Yeah, don't underestimate the value of fan sourcing, especially if you maybe have fallen behind in the story Bible a little bit.
Yeah.
So any one of these topics, we could probably have spent an entire episode on any one of these topics, but I want to save a little bit of time to give you a chance to talk briefly about your Kickstarter. So Greta, I'll throw this out to you if you want to give us a little background.
Sure. So by the time this releases, it will probably be well underway and going. And it's our first Kickstarter. We're super excited. What we're doing is we're taking those first 3 quick guides that we've been discussing. So what we decided to do is, instead of writing one long book about, how to write a novel from beginning to end, there are books like that out there, and great books like that out there. So we decided, instead of doing something like that, what we were going to do is we were going to take all the different little puzzle pieces that are necessary to learn and know about in this whole author world thing. and write short, topical, quick guides that people can read in a couple of hours. And then we have a big resources section at the end of each of them. So if they want to go deeper into any topic, they can go deeper. Because what we discovered when we were teaching courses is often people didn't even know the questions they needed to ask. They didn't even have the big picture view of something. So they didn't even know what they didn't know. So that's what our quick guides are kind of like. Okay, here's all the stuff about productive writing habits, because you think you're just going to sit down and write and it's going to be like one of those movies, and you're going to go away to a beach house or a mountain house and write your book in a week. And like, that is so not what writing is like. It's more like, remember college and all those assignments you had to do? It's like a lot more like that. And it takes a lot of time, especially in the beginning. You do get faster. So we put together a short resource on how do you set yourself up for success and get a book done? What can you expect? And then the similar thing with genre, and then planning a novel. And we do have ideas for other quick guides because it's sort of a series. But we wrote those three, and those three are the things to do before you even start to plot and plan. I mean, we do have planning a novel, but it's called planning, not plotting, because we don't even go into plotting in it. They're all the things you do before you actually sit down and start to create the story itself.
Okay.
And now,
And-
Megan, they've explained the quick guides. You can explain the Kickstarter.
All right. So we're taking those 3 quick guides and we're actually adding in an exclusive section just available through the Kickstarter, which is going to be on developing your author strategy. It'll be a similar style, a similar section to the overall book. We're combining those 4 things into an omnibus paperback or ebook. And then we're creating online courses for each of those. So what we decided was that we have the quick guides, and that's like a couple hours read, but people need or want an additional deep dive. They have different learning styles, whether they need extra demonstrations or hands-on, that kind of a thing. So these courses are designed to fit with each of those individual sections. So through the Kickstarter, you can, if you buy our top level tier package, you get the paperback or ebook or both book, plus the 3 courses, plus then we're doing live Q&A calls for each of the sections, so that if you have specific questions that you want to ask and you've backed us through the Kickstarter, we want to be able to provide that extra small group Q&A calls. And the idea being that our whole goal through the author wheel is to help writers overcome the obstacles that they're facing in their writing so that they can actually achieve their goals and find success as an author, as a writer. And this package, this Kickstarter package that we're putting together, is all the struggles that we've had, all the lessons that we've learned, so that our students don't have to spend hours and hours and hours and thousands and thousands and thousands of words making those same mistakes. We're going to try and help you get over those hurdles faster. And so that's what it is. And so it's called Foundations of Great Storytelling, Preparing to Write is the actual Kickstarter name.
Great. And where would people go to find out more about it?
So if you go to our website, authorwheel.com/stuff, it's the first link at the top of the page. And if you go to Kickstarter, you can search the author wheel and it'll come up.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for sort of a sneak peek into the content. Thanks to both of you for sharing that info, and come back on the notes for the episode and let us know how the Kickstarter is going.
Absolutely.
I'd love
we
to.
will.
Yeah. Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much, Maddie, for having us on. It was great.
Sure. Thank you.